Chapter 80. The City of Waters. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. As Ruth's eagle descended into the sky, Minos could see the city lights getting closer and closer. This was an even bigger city than the Yellow City, with more than 100,000 inhabitants. Minos had obtained this information from the butler Dillion before they left Dry City. According to the information he had received, this city had a slightly better spiritual density than the Yellow City and had no problems with criminal groups. And this place was not considered a burden by the noble families of the Cromwell Kingdom. After all, with the tax levied by the local sovereign, it was still possible to earn more than 500,000 crystals a year in this place. And there was local agriculture, which yielded another slice as big. Because of this, the family that was the sovereign of this region had someone managing and even investing in the city. Of course, it was nothing impressive, but at least there were investments here, unlike the Yellow City and the old Dry City before Minos arrived. But it was not only that. This city had two large regional rivers passing through here, which facilitated access to exports and imports from the region and facilitated people's lives. This was also very useful for the crops planted here in this city. Thus, due to the geographical characteristics of this region, this place was known as the City of Waters, where two great rivers of this part of the continent converged and went together towards the ocean. Elena had told Minos to attract the people of this city to his own territory. Still, he realized that she did not know precisely the reality of this place. Because even though this was a border region with the Black Plain, there were no problems with the local soil. The population could cultivate the land in the area, and the spiritual density was slightly better than that of the Dry City, even after the spiritual arrays. All of this made it more difficult for the Minos region to recruit people from this place. But he would still try this since that was the best alternative that remained after the Yellow City. And if only the unemployed population left the city, perhaps the sovereign family would not go so far with this. Finally, Minos and Ruth descended from the north side of the city, where there was one of the entrances to the town. When they arrived at this place, there was almost no movement. After all, it was already night, and it was not advisable to travel after that time. Some cultivators wore clothes with the same pattern on this site, which looks like a crown with 3 teeth. This was the symbol of the royal family of the Cromwell Kingdom. Oh! The royal family of this kingdom even dispatched soldiers to this place. Minos thought about it when he saw the guards' uniforms, who were standing at this entrance to the city. Having soldiers of the royal family in border cities was very common. After all, this was how the kingdoms had to control the entry and exit of people from their realms. This just didn't happen in the Yellow City because it was too insignificant for the Kingdom of the Waves. Still, there would certainly be a post with royal guards in the next city. Good night, and welcome to the Cromwell Kingdom. If you are allied merchants in the kingdom, there is no entry fee. Otherwise, you must pay a tax of 400 low-grade spiritual crystals per person. A guard said as he looked at Ruth strangely. It wasn't every day that he saw such beauty. But immediately, the guard's expression froze when he saw young Ruth takes a red medallion from her spatial ring. This was a very important symbol that any guard in this kingdom would recognize. The flaming medallion. The guard said in disbelief. He could not believe that he had looked luxuriously at someone who came from the Flaming Empire and had a medallion from one of the prominent sects. This was an item used by members dispatched by the great sects of that empire to observe the spiritual tournament. They even had the power to invite someone into the empire. Therefore, someone with possession of this item would be treated in the best possible way in any kingdom in the north of the central continent. Sorry, madam, there is no need to pay any fees. He said quickly as he looked at the floor. Humph, let's go, Minos. She said coldly as they entered the city. She didn't want to waste her time teaching that guard a lesson just because he pissed her off a little. Minos then said quietly so that Ruth would think he didn't want her to hear. That's the problem with being so pretty. Upon hearing this, she smiled slightly in satisfaction. In the meantime, they proceeded to the central part of the city, where Ruth said there was a decent hotel for them to spend the night. As they walked through the streets of the City of Waters, Minos could see how lively this place was. Many people came and went on the streets, with several low-level spiritual beasts and even a few carriages. The place also had many lighting arrays on the streets, making it more pleasant to walk around this place at night than in the Minos city. This is because there were not many lighting arrays in the dry city yet. After all, Minos needed to invest in more urgent matters at the moment. And also, because there was nowhere where these items were sold before the deal he had made with merchant Lance Cohen. Because of that, the dry city was still a bad place to stroll at night since most of the city had to be lit by whale oil lamps. But Minos had already planned to change that as soon as possible. With the arrival of the Cohen family store, that could certainly be changed in a few months, when his forces had the budget to do this. Finally, after passing through some buildings and public squares, Minos and Ruth finally arrived at the hotel. This place had a large 6-story building, with several terraces and a name written on the top of the building, saying, Midnight Hotel. There was no outside or living area, just a place to park carriages before stopping there. Shortly after that, Minos and Ruth entered the reception and were attended to by a middle-aged man. Good night, welcome to the Midnight Hotel. Can I find out if you have a reservation? The man asked politely while sitting on the opposite side of a long counter. Ruth then said, I don't have a reservation, but we are only going to spend the night. I think 2 common rooms are fine for us. Oh. Then that's it. Let me see how the availability is. The man said in a low voice as he turned to look at a frame with many numbers and staples. But there was only one key in one of the clamps. Unfortunately, I only have 1 room left. He said in disappointment. Are you going to want this room? Upon hearing this, Ruth blushed and said, I think we're going to look for another hotel. I understand, but I really recommend that you keep this room. Minos then looked at the man and asked. Why you say this? Well, you must know about the spiritual tournament that is going to happen in a few weeks in our kingdom, right? Because of this, many people are passing through the city right now. After all, not only are competitors going to this tournament. The man said sincerely. He was trying to help Minos and Ruth since they might as well be left with no options if they left. Okay, I understand. So, let's keep this room. Minos said quickly. Upon hearing this, the man at the front desk turned to get the keys to the room, while Ruth was frozen and completely embarrassed beside Minos. Although sexuality in the spiritual world was quite libertine, Ruth was a lady who was still a virgin and had not been interested in anyone in the past. She also lived most of the time within the Grey Cloud sect, where she was protected from many of the world's problems. So, it was pretty embarrassing for her to sleep in the same room with a man. And even if she thought a lot about Minos, it was just something related to his achievements and the mysteries involved with this young man. After receiving the key and directions from the receptionist, Minos pulled Ruth and went to their room on the 3rd floor of the building. Upon arriving in the room, the two saw a large double bed, in the middle of the room, with a beautiful red carpet covering the sides of the bed and some decorative furniture, with an armchair near the balcony. The room was very cozy, with a bathroom and a small kitchen. After closing the door, Minos said with a smile on his face. If you want, I can sleep in the armchair. No, you have a smaller cultivate than mine. You must be more tired from the trip. I sleep in the armchair, and you have the bed. Ruth replied, her face still hot from the situation. Her heart was beating rapidly, and her breathing was gradually increasing. No, if that is the case, we can both sleep in the bed. I can't let a woman spend the night in an armchair. But. She wanted to reject that, but she didn't know what to say. Minos realized that she was very nervous, so he approached Ruth and hugged her while saying in her ear. Rest assured. I would never force anything. We're just going to sleep in the same bed. That doesn't mean that something has to happen. Chapter 81. Peculiar early morning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hearing what Minos had said, Ruth felt better and almost forgot that he was holding her. That's right. There is nothing wrong with spending the night with him in the same bed. I've known him for months, and I know I can trust him. Ruth began to convince herself that this was an acceptable situation for her. She lived with Minos for a long time, and she spent a lot of time thinking about the mysteries that involved the young steward and how responsible he was. So, she would have no problem sleeping with him in the same bed. After all, she wouldn't make much difference sleeping in the bed or the armchair. They would still be in the same room, and if something were to happen, it wouldn't change much. A few seconds passed, and Ruth finally noticed something. Heh! Is he hugging me all this time? How did I not notice? She thought a little worried as she felt the heat of Minos' body enveloping her. After feeling that Ruth was much calmer, Minos slowly released the hug and looked towards the bathroom before asking. Do you want to use the bathroom first? I want to cultivate before taking my shower. When she heard this, Ruth immediately stopped thinking about Minos and answered while she blushed. Okay, I'll go first. After that, Minos sat on the ground and cultivated for 2 hours straight. Ruth had also started to cultivate after taking her bath. After all, the cultivation itself was not very tiring for the cultivators. It was like meditation. After Minos finished cultivating, he could feel that his advance to the next level was getting closer and closer and should occur in a week at most. As for training the other techniques he used, Minos decided to do that tomorrow. This is because there was practically no single suitable place for this between the dry city and the city of waters. It was just a large, desolate plain, almost completely exposed to anyone passing by. But after passing through the city of waters, there were forests and some mountains between the cities that they were going to pass through until they reached the capital of the Cromwell Kingdom. With that, Minos planned to train during this trip, stopping at least once every 2 days to train his attack, defense, and support techniques. After cultivation, Minos immediately went to take his bath. It didn't take long, and both youths had already done their duties and had dinner when the two decided to go to bed. At that moment, Ruth, who usually wore clothes that valued her body, was wearing a loose-fitting shirt and trousers so as not to attract Minos' attention. On the other hand, the young steward usually slept only in trousers and did not differ this time. He was not a shy person, and if that prompted the beautiful Ruth to do something, then he would be delighted. Upon seeing Minos sitting on the bed, Ruth immediately grabbed one of the pillows and separated that area. She said, "This side of mine is mine, and this other side is yours. Don't go over this limit, right?" Okay. Relax, I know that. Minos laughed and said while watching Ruth's beautiful, flushed face. It didn't take long, and the two lay in silence on the bed. Minos soon fell asleep since he did not expect that something would happen. If Ruth had been easy, then it would have happened long ago. As for Ruth, due to the nervousness of sleeping with a man for the first time, she took a long time to fall asleep, while her heart was racing, to the point that she could almost hear the sounds of her own heartbeat. The night passed quickly, and the first rays of the sun could already be seen in the city of waters. The city soon began to come to life, with some people leaving their homes and starting their respective duties. Meanwhile, on the 3rd floor of the Midnight Hotel, in the room where Minos and Ruth were staying, two youths were hugging each other in a big bed while they slept. Pillows were scattered on the floor, while the blanket they used was now at the foot of the bed. Minos was lying on his back, dressed in the same way he went to sleep, while his right hand was wrapped around Ruth's back. As for the beautiful young woman, she was without her shirt, hugging Minos with her head resting on his chest and her legs wrapped around the young steward's waist. Her long black hair was tousled, and the young woman's beautiful breasts were clinging to Minos's body. Nothing had happened between the two, but during the night, while sleeping, the beautiful young woman felt a little heat and decided to take off her shirt. And of course, while she was unconscious, she didn't mind doing this, even though she was in the same bed as Minos. As to why she wasn't wearing a bra, well, that was because it was more comfortable to sleep without wearing it. And as a cultivator, she didn't have to worry about any problems that this could cause to her body. Time passed, and soon Minos woke up. He felt something strange while sleeping, as if he were being touched by something. And as soon as he opened his eyes, he saw a beautiful scene in front of him. Ruth was sleeping peacefully on his chest, shirtless, and with her breasts, the sample for him. He could even vaguely see the small, pink beak of Ruth's nipples, which glued to his belly. I didn't think Ruth was so honest with herself while she slept. He thought with a smile on his face as he stroked the young woman's bare back. It didn't take long, and soon Ruth woke up from her beauty sleep. She had spent one of the best nights of the past few weeks. What a good sleep. She then massaged Minos's chest with one hand and touched something. Why is the bed so hot? She thought about it just before opening her eyes and realizing what was going on. And she realized not only that but also that she was half naked while she hugged Minos. When he saw that Ruth was awake, Minos smiled at her and just said, "Good morning, Ruth." But instead of answering him with a "good morning," Ruth just let out a cry of shock. Her face was flushed as she came out of Minos's embrace, covering her breasts with the blanket that was at the foot of the bed. Minos then said with a provocative smile on his face when looking into her eyes, "Ruth, it looks like your body is pretty honest, so why don't you just take it? You don't have to be ashamed." This not," she said, stammering, not knowing what to say to Minos. She was so nervous about going to sleep with Minos that she had forgotten that it was not uncommon for her to take off her shirt while she slept. As to why she had crossed her partition and came to sleep hugging Minos, not even she was sure. She had been thinking about him a lot lately, but that was just because there were so many mysteries around Minos. It didn't mean she was interested in him. At that moment, Ruth's heart was beating so fast that it looked like it could leave her body at any moment. What a shame. How am I going to look at him now? She thought as she looked away from Minos. Realizing this, Minos decided to comfort her. If that wasn't resolved, then she might end up starting to behave differently to him, and that wouldn't be a good thing. He then got up and went towards her slowly. "Okay, Ruth, you don't have to be ashamed of this. You don't have to worry about me thinking something strange about you," he said softly while taking the young woman's hands, while she was looking to the side, completely flushed. As he got a little closer, Minos brought her hands to him while he pulled her waist to his. He then started to hug her while he said, "You are very beautiful, Ruth. I'm happy to see you that way, but know that if you don't want anything like that with me, just pretend this didn't happen. There is no need to be ashamed." After hearing this, Ruth stood for a while and then slowly turned her head to look into Minos's eyes. Her heart was still racing when she slowly brought her lips closer to Minos. Seeing this, Minos celebrated internally and responded in the same way. The two finally kissed, while Ruth dropped the blanket that was covering her body to hold Minos' neck, and he held her around the waist. The two kissed passionately for about 5 minutes while rolling over in bed and touching each other. At that point, Ruth was on top of Minos while feeling the young steward's hard stick nudging her when she quickly stopped kissing him and said in a low voice, I'm not ready for that yet." "Okay, I can wait," Minos said, looking her in the eye. After this peculiar early morning, the two youths ate their breakfast in silence before changing clothes and leaving the hotel to continue their journey to the capital of the Cromwell Kingdom. Chapter 82. I accept the challenge. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At this time, Minos and Ruth were ready to leave the City of Waters and continue their journey through the Cromwell Kingdom. Minos had no intention of himself staying here and analyzing this place. That would not even be ideal, as he has not yet reached level 40. However, that did not mean that the Black Plane would not begin to check this place. Previously, Dillion had obtained only the basic information about this city. However, they still did not know more essential questions, such as what family was governing this city and how strong this place was. Thus, the Black Plain Army would send a group of soldiers on a reconnaissance mission in a short time. They would live in the City of Waters for some time until they discovered the most relevant information for the Dry City plan. This should happen even before Minos returns from the spiritual tournament, within 3 months from now. At that time, the number of army soldiers would have been considerably more significant than today, making it possible to maintain activities like this. As they left the City of Waters, Minos and Ruth discussed the journey they would take in front of them. At that moment, Minos was walking beside Ruth while the two went to fetch the Great Eagle at the city's northern exit. "Ruth, as I said before, I want to make this trip little by little, stopping to train along the way." I know. There are more than 20 cities between where we are to the kingdom's capital. There are some forests and mountains on this route that are also useful for you to train," she said with an expression still ashamed. She couldn't ignore the fact that they had been kissing for just a few minutes. "Oh. That is great. Let's do this. We will travel on your Eagle 8 hours a day, and then we will stop to train and rest for the remaining hours," Minos said with a satisfied smile. He liked to stay and train in the Dry City and the Spatial Kingdom, but he wanted to see the world like any other youth. So, if he was going to make this trip anyway, then he might as well make the most of it. "Okay," Ruth said as they finally arrived where White was waiting for them, at the city's northern exit. It didn't take long, and the two climbed on the Great Eagle and flew through the skies, with Minos hugging tightly to Ruth's waist while White took off. Meanwhile, on the coast of the Black Plain, there was a medium-sized port in the middle of nowhere, which had the capacity to allocate up to 3 ships at once. From this location, not far away, one could see a medium-sized ship slowly approaching the port. There was a prominent silver ship symbol on the ship's bow while 2 sailors talked just above that place. "Oh. So, is this the place where we're going to pick up that load? How strange, I didn't know there was a port in this region," a man with blonde hair said while covering his eyes from the sun and looking at the port, which was getting closer and closer. Why don't they use the maritime city to do this business? At least there we have something to do while the ship is loaded," a young man complained. Shortly after that, a third man wearing a Nash Family Guard uniform approached the two and said, "Stop the small talk. This business is essential for Miss Elin. You are too soft. It seems that I have to harden your training." "Yes, Captain." The two responded in unison as they returned to their respective areas. It didn't take long, and the ship docked at the port, where there was a building not far away with a symbol of a golden tree. This was the symbol that Minos had chosen to represent his power. And that was the base that had been ordered months ago. It was currently in the whole operation, with about 50 soldiers divided between the 4th and 5th stages of cultivation. The place had also already received the 200 tons divided into grains, cereals, and spiritual fruits that Minos had promised Elin. As they descended from the ship, some men of the Nash family began to help the soldiers of the Black Plain Army to load the ship. At the same time, the captain of the ship watched the place with curiosity. "A golden tree. I've never seen this symbol before. Where is that power from?" He massaged his face as he thought about it. Soon after, he scanned the items that were being shipped and was surprised. All of these foods have a very high spiritual concentration." He then mumbled while having a look of shock in his eyes. "It is not for less. So, Miss Nash ordered me to prioritize these items before we went to the Cromwell Kingdom. How lucky she was to get such good items." After that, it didn't take long, and all the cargo transfer was done when the ship finally started to return to Stone Island. While the Nash family ship was on its way, Minos and Ruth had been traveling for almost 3 hours continuously, when the two finally decided to go down in a forest. White quickly descended from the skies, stopping in an open area in the middle of that forest. In that place, there was grass for most of the land, and not far away, oversized trees could be seen. It was not a closed forest, but it was still quite wooded, to the point that someone would get lost if he wasn't careful. "Ruth, do you want to train with me a little? It won't be bad to match someone as strong as you," Minos said to the young woman after finding an appropriate place to begin his training. She then looked at him with a surprised expression and said it firmly. "Are you sure about that? I don't take it easy, and there is a big difference between our cultivation." Considering that I advanced one level since I fought the last time, I believe that if I use everything I have, I could defeat an average person at level 43. Minos started calculating and then said. "Considering that you have 2 techniques of silver grade and are at level 45, if you fight with less than 50% of your strength, then that can work." "Oh. 50%, you say? So, wouldn't that mean that all of your techniques are golden grade?" She said with a smile on her face. She had already seen Minos fight, but she didn't think he would be that good, to the point of being able to match her, who was 9 levels above him. Minos smiled and then said as he tried to change the focus of the conversation. "I have an innate ability that allows me to increase the reserved energy." "Oh. So, that's why you are so strong," she exclaimed in joy. This was the first time she had any information about Minos' mysteries. Minos then approached her with a flirtatious smile and said. "Look, I told you a secret of mine. Do you have any innate abilities that can be used in fights?" "No, my innate ability is not for fighting." This was not uncommon in the spiritual world. It was very difficult to be born with a physique that provided an innate ability that could be useful in fights. There were many possibilities, and those battle-related characteristics were just one of many subdivisions. There were innate skills of all kinds, which could range from increasing someone's potential when making spiritual pills to predicting the future and even cooking. Therefore, not many were lucky, like Minos, to have a skill that increased their spiritual energy. Minos then asked curiously. "Then, won't you tell me what your skill is?" Ruth smiled provocatively and said. If, or rather, when you manage to beat me when I'm fighting with everything I have, maybe I'll tell you." She knew that it was only a matter of time before he reached her with his cultivation speed. And at that time, she wouldn't be able to beat him. "Oh. Okay, I accept your challenge. It may take a few months for me to be strong enough, but I will definitely do that." He then took a blind sword from his spatial ring and prepared to fight. Ruth then asked in a soft voice. "Are you ready?" Come on." In saying these words, he immediately activated his 3 techniques at once. Devouring Art. Indestructible Body. Spatial Sword. A black ring then appeared around the sky, above Minos. At the same time, Ruth activated her techniques with only half of her usual strength and headed towards where Minos was. Fists of Pain. Instant Steps. But she did not use her defense technique. That's because there was no need. With her movement technique alone, she would already be able to dodge Minos' attacks. This would be a battle of resistance for him and not for her. Chapter 83. Was I beaten? You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Entering the range of Minos' techniques, Ruth felt a slight sense of suppression, but that was all. Even if she used only half of her usual strength, she couldn't ignore some of her cultivation's own capabilities. As a result, Ruth was able to ignore most of the adverse effects that Minos' techniques did on her. Shit. The devouring art is hardly having an effect on her. Minos reflected on this, feeling the amount of spiritual energy that his support technique was returning to him. He concluded that it was hardly worthwhile to activate this technique since its energy expenditure alone consumed almost everything it absorbed. And at the same time, while Ruth was moving to attack Minos, she was also a little surprised. Even if it was not significant, her still spiritual power was still gradually decreasing. But it was still nothing to make her retreat. With the current absorption rate, even if she stayed here all day, without even counterattacking, she still wouldn't have her spiritual energy depleted by minus technique. Ruth could also sense that her speed was being subtly reduced. This shocked her even more since her technique was a silver. Grade 1, and even if she were not using all her strength, she would still have a perfect energy conversion. This technique that is reducing my speed is excellent. It is definitely superior to my moving technique. Ruth thought about it when she approached to attack Minus. At the same time, as she was throwing a punch at Minus's chest, young Stuart made a smooth movement with his sword, attacking his opponent's shoulder with the sword. Minus had no intention of countering Ruth's attack technique since he was confident in his own defense. So, the only way he could beat the beautiful young woman would be to force her to run out. Swoosh! Pow! The sword's blade ran towards Ruth's shoulder while a fist-shaped cluster of energy flew towards Minus's chest. Upon understanding what Minus was trying to do, Ruth smiled in satisfaction and used her movement technique to deflect her opponent's attack successfully. Poof! At the same time, Minus was hit hard by Ruth's attack when a hollow sound was heard. The defense of young Stuart almost entirely absorbed the attack. Minus then took a few steps back while keeping his balance and not falling. Ah, damn it, she's very fast. Meanwhile, Ruth smiled at him and said provocatively. What? Can't take it anymore. Haha, how can I not take it anymore? He said as he started to breathe irregularly. You can come. I can still last a long time. After that, it didn't take long, and the two continued to exchange blows, with Ruth constantly dodging Minus' sword attacks and him having to endure her blows while gradually spending his own spiritual energy. Pow! Ruth sent out the last of her attacks when Minus was no longer able to counterattack, using all that was left just to defend himself. At that point, he was already completely sweaty and a little pale, while his breathing was very irregular. Ah! He finally let out the first cry of pain from the fight when he was thrown more than 10 meters. The battle had lasted a total of 4 minutes, and Ruth had entirely suppressed young Minus during almost the entire match. The beautiful young woman was practically in the same condition as when she started the fight, without a drop of sweat on her beautiful milky skin, and still had her clothes as clean as before. For Minus, on the other hand, there were some tears in his clothes, while there were some bloodstains here and there. Even using only half of his usual strength, Ruth's punches were still strong enough to ignore Minus' defense. By his count, he managed to absorb only about 90% of Ruth's attack at the beginning of his defense fight. With that, the damage was accumulated, and his defense started to lose efficiency with the constant consumption of spiritual energy, leading to the miserable situation that Minus was in now. Upon seeing Minus being thrown yet again by her attack, Ruth ran towards him and said, "Well, your spiritual energy is almost depleted. Let's stop this for today. Start cultivating. I'll keep an eye on you," she said sweetly while checking Minus' condition. Minus had no significant injuries, only a few abrasions and great spiritual exhaustion caused by the continuous receiving of blows. It was not long before the young Stuart sat down in a meditative position and began to cultivate using some low-grade spiritual crystals. And at the same time, Ruth took some apples out of her spatial ring and started watching the surroundings while she ate and recovered the little energy she had spent in this fight. 2 hours later, Minus had fully recovered and was already wearing a different set of clothes. He had used his own spiritual energy to clean himself and was now lying on a rock, not far from where he and Ruth had recently fought. Minus then looked at the sky while he was still lying on his back on the rock and said in a low voice, "It looks like it will be a long time before I can defeat you. Huh, it's good that you know that. You must not forget how I beat you," she said as she laughed happily. She was sitting while waiting for Minus, a few feet from him. Was I beaten? Upon hearing this, Minus frowned in denial and then stood up. He went over to her, saying, "We will not remember this that way. For me, it was more like a test of endurance, saying that I was beaten is not right here. But I will remember it that way," Ruth said with a mischievous smile on her face. "That's right." Minos moved closer to her and then bent down and pulled Ruth by one of her arms until they were embraced. The two looked at each other for a moment when Ruth's face quickly blushed, and the two began to kiss in the middle of this forest. Strong Ruth, momentarily, looked like a fragile young woman who had fallen into the clutches of a predator. Her body trembled when a soft object slowly entered her mouth, enveloping her tongue and massaging it in several ways. At the same time, Minos took the opportunity to touch Ruth's beautiful curves, stimulating several sensitive parts of the beautiful young woman's body. They then leaned against a tree and remained kissing pleasantly for a few minutes. The sounds of kisses could be heard in the air, while Minos had his stick as hard as a rock, and Ruth felt some strange feelings on her body. She could raise her temperature while her face was flushed and her heart was beating fast. The private parts were considerably more sensitive at that point, and her little sister seemed to be getting more and more oiled. Minos then parted his lips from Ruth's beautiful pink lips while continuing to gently suck the young girl's earlobe, making her feel goosebumps. At this point, Ruth finally looked into Minos' face with cloudy eyes as she felt extremely excited. But she wanted to be strong. She still didn't think she was ready to give her first time, so once again, she had interrupted her own desire. She also didn't want this to happen in the middle of a forest. Sensing this, Minos also stopped his movements slowly, respecting the girl's desire. He was also not against waiting, by the way, as they would still spend a few months together. He wanted to try and make the sexual tension of the two reach a high level. With that, what he would achieve with Ruth would be even better than his experience with Elena. With that, he had good expectations for what would happen in the future with him and the beautiful young Ruth. Let's see how long you will hold on. When the time comes, the feeling repressed for weeks will be explosive, giving us an even better pleasure than regular occasions. He thought with satisfaction while looking at Ruth with a burning desire. Shortly after that, Minos and Ruth climbed up on the great white eagle, which was watching them only a dozen meters away. "Come on, let's travel for a few more hours before we stop to rest in the next city," Ruth said with a smile on her face. With that, it didn't take long, and the young couple took off from this piece of the forest where they had stopped to do their training section. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Cromwell kingdom, there was a group of 4 people, 2 of whom were middle-aged men, who appeared to be escorting the other 2 that they were a young man and a lady, who looked to be no more than 18 years old. "Young master, it looks like they found warrior-grade medicine in the peak of the fog," one of the men said as he looked at the 2 youths in front of him. Chapter 84. Santa Clara. You are listening at novelfull.audio. "Oh. This is interesting," the young man said with a smile on his face. He had long red hair and gray eyes, with a beauty that would easily put him among the top in this part of the continent. As for the warrior-grade medicine, this was a medicine used to refining spiritual pills between grade .1, high level, and grade .2, low level. Medicine like this could be helpful to produce spiritual pills for advancing to the 5th stage and for other types of pills for cultivators at the beginning of this stage of cultivation. As for the classification it received, the medicines were divided into common, warrior, real, saint, and divine. Each medicine had different uses, considering its classification, with the medicines of saint grade being the ones with greater possibilities. How much better the pill's potency depended not only on the ability of medicine but also on the alchemist level. For this reason, a more skilled and higher-ranking alchemist could use the ingredients of their pill to the limit and achieve better rankings. But each medicine had its limit, and in the case of warrior-grade medicine, it was grade .2, low-level pills. The young woman, who also had red hair and gray eyes, smiled and said, "Big brother, are we going to take this medicine?" For us, medicine at this level is not so relevant. We already have a lot of resources at our disposal. Let's leave that to our competitors. At least that will animate things in this tournament. Haha. The young man said confidently. But it will not be easy for other participants of lesser powers to achieve this. Even if it is only a warrior-grade medicine, it is not easy to harvest without injuring its spirituality. The other man in the group said, considering the consequences of this. It was complicated to harvest a wild medicine like that. There were usually specific techniques that alchemists used to harvest these plants, but there were no alchemists in this competition. Therefore, to harvest such a plant without a suitable technique, people who would harvest it had to have enough spiritual energy to handle it without damaging its general structure. That's right. Suppose none of the people who are going after this don't have an alchemist in the group. In that case, they need at least one spiritual king to harvest this plant without it being damaged. The young master said as he rubbed his face. The girl then said excitedly. But forget that for now, I want to get to the capital of the Cromwell Kingdom soon. I heard that some of the greatest geniuses in our region are already there. Let's get going then. After saying this, the group left the city where they were going through a large gate with the inscriptions, City of Flowers. Meanwhile, Minos and Ruth were almost reaching the city where they would spend the night when white began to descend from the skies slowly. It was already dark at this point, and the city lights nearby could be seen from afar. This place seemed to be even bigger than the City of Waters, where they had previously stopped. At the time, Minos was talking to Ruth about ordinary everyday things at the Grey Cloud sect. He then asked. You seem to know a lot about the Cromwell Kingdom. Have you traveled here many times? She shook her head and said. No, in fact, this is only the second time that I have left the Flaming Empire. The first time was with my master when we visited you in the Dry City a few months ago. Normally, the disciples of the sects in my region can only leave the empire on 4 occasions. Minos then cut off her speech. He said. And why is that? Let me finish talking. She then continued. To leave the territory of the empire, we have to be accompanied by a superior. This is the first possibility. The second is that we have reached the level of a spiritual king, the third if we have a family urgency outside the confines of the empire. And the fourth, if we receive a mission, as in my case. These conditions are because the Flaming Empire has some external enemies that are dangerous to weaker people. After all, not all disciples receive silver-grade techniques like me. She said with a proud expression on her face. But even people like me, they still have to follow these rules to preserve the power of the Flaming Empire sections. But at the interior of the empire, we can leave the territories of our sects usually. I see. Minos thought reflexively. He thought of his mother's case, but that was only a second. Considering Minos' age and Maisie's cultivation level, then she was certainly already a spiritual emperor when she became pregnant with him. In that case, this would not justify her prolonged absence. Minos then buried these thoughts in his mind and the great eagle finally landed it in one of the city's entrances that they were seeing in the distance a few minutes ago. This place was called Santa Clara, a city with more than 300,000 inhabitants and a highly well-developed local agriculture. In fact, this was one of the cities that exported grains and cereals to the Dry City before the cultures of Minos started to develop in the territories of the Black Plain. These areas had an average spiritual concentration, much like the city of Portland, on Stone Island. And as soon as he entered the city, Minos could see how rich this place was. It was extremely well lit, with wide streets and avenues, gardens spread over different parts of the city, and many buildings in the Gothic style. It was beautiful to see. There were even lighting arrays on the sidewalls of the structures so that it could be displayed, even when it was the night. Wow, what an extravagance, these people did not skimp on spending on lighting arrays. Minos murmured while enjoying the beautiful view of this city. Hearing the comment in a low voice from Minos, Ruth, who was beside him, laughed softly without making a noise. For her, Minus' behavior was like that of a hick who came out of nowhere and experienced an advanced civilization. It was hilarious for her to see that. How silly, I wanted to see your reaction when you go to the City of Clouds. She laughed softly while having one of her hands hiding her lips. After riding around the city in a carriage that they had hired at the entrance to Santa Clara, Ruth and Minus had dinner at a restaurant recommended by the coachman. This was a pleasant place, but for Minus, who had already tried the delicacies of the barbecue temple in the capital of Stone Island, this place did not attract the attention of the young steward. As for the beautiful Ruth, she came from an empire, so her culinary tastes were at an even higher level than Minus. For her, these occasions were necessary only to supply the nutrition that her body still needed. And after eating, the two were taken to a hotel in the downtown area, where the best place to stay in Santa Clara was. At least, that's what the coachman told them as he made his way to the Viola Hotel. Upon arriving at this place, Minus and Ruth studied the stained glass windows and vaults of the building for an instant. There were also some strange sculptures in several places. Upon arriving at the reception, there were two young attendants, with one receiving another guest who had just arrived and the other free. Minus then approached and heard the girl's thin voice. "Welcome to the Viola Hotel. What service are you looking for?" The young woman asked politely. Minus smiled and said, "Give me a double room, preferably one that is medium size." Upon hearing Minus' request, Ruth immediately opened my mouth to say something, but no words had come out. She understood very well what young Stewart was doing. Still, it seemed that her body unconsciously wanted it too, preventing her from going against that decision. At the same time that Ruth faced her existential dilemma, the young attendant had already collected the deposit from Minus and handed over the keys to the room in which they would spend the night. After that, Minus took one of Ruth's hands and brought it to the 5th floor, where their room was located. Upon arriving in the room, the two took a good look at the place before they began to cultivate quietly. There was a large double bed in this room, which could easily accommodate 4 people at once, with a large balcony and a beautiful red curtain. There were also some pictures on the walls with paintings from the Santa Clara region, spiritual plants, and several decorative pieces of furniture. There was also a place made specifically for people to cultivate comfortably, with 2 purple cushions on the floor. At that time, Ruth circulated her silver-grade cultivation technique and spread several spiritual crystals around her. She was much more focused than usual because today, she felt she was going to go up to level 46. Chapter 85. Valley of the Beasts. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. After cultivating for 4 hours continuously, Ruth finally reached the peak of level 45 and advanced to the next level. Crack. She quickly felt her spiritual energy rise when she realized that she was already at level 46. After that, Ruth slowly opened her eyes, stepping out of her meditative position. In doing so, she saw Minus not far away, looking towards her with a smile on her face. It looks like you just leveled up, right? Congratulations on that." Thanks," she said, pleased with herself. The feeling of leveling up was always very good for any cultivator, making them very happy after getting it. It didn't take long, and the two went to bed to rest for the next day of travel that they would have ahead of them. And, of course, the two exchanged some caresses before going to sleep and stopping while the flame of desire was still controllable. The night passed quickly, and the day had already dawned in the city of Santa Clara, where Minus and Ruth were staying. At that moment, on the 5th floor of the Hotel Viola, where the two youths' rooms were, there were 2 half-naked people in the big bed of the room, playing with each other. The young man with brown hair was fervently kissing the young woman with full breasts who was lying on top of him. He had one of his hands on one of the young girl's beautiful breasts, which had a small, pinkish nipple, which was stiff at that moment due to constant stimulation. At the same time, Minus's other hand was on Ruth's seductive ass, while he occasionally made his fingers follow the path of the long-haired girl's little sister. She was very wet at that moment, and every time the young steward touched her, Ruth let out a sensual moan of pleasure. They continued their wonderful early morning when the young woman suddenly opened her misty eyes and said while she was breathing irregularly, "Ah! Something is coming." Upon hearing this, Minos continued his movements, making her moan even louder than usual, as he touched Ruth's small pink pearl. That was when she finally released her sweet juice, wetting her panties entirely and leaving Minos' fingers completely soaked. Haa. Ruth lay next to Minos, breathing quickly as she felt her conscience float. She had never felt such a pleasant sensation in her life. At that point, she turned to Minos and watched him with a happy look on her face. However, Minos's following action made her a little nervous when he slowly brought his fingers wet with Ruth's juices to his own mouth and tasted it. "No," she said in a low voice when she saw Minos's sudden action. She did not expect that he would do such a disgusting thing. After all, she was a maiden who had no experience. As for the young steward, well, he had learned from the experienced Elena, who had shown him many exciting things. You taste fabulous, Ruth," Minos said after experiencing his partner's taste and looking into her eyes. Upon hearing this, Ruth did not understand very well, but unconsciously she was pleased to be praised by Minos. After that, the two took a long shower while playing a little more, but nothing more in-depth had happened. They quickly put on different clothes and left the hotel to travel for a few more hours. At that moment, Minos and Ruth were flying on the Great White Eagle, while they saw from a distance the place where they were going to stop for training. This was the Valley of the Beasts, a considerably large region of the Cromwell Kingdom, where there were several races of low-level beasts. According to the information that Minos and Ruth had obtained, this place was even bigger than the entire Black Plain, and there was no city in the middle of these areas. After the city of Santa Clara, they could fly for just over a day on their fourth-stage spiritual beast, arriving at the next town on their way, which was called the City of Flowers. But Minos wanted to stop to practice on his trip, so they had to pass through the Valley of the Beasts and go through it, little by little, until they arrived in the City of Flowers in about 3 days. Upon seeing an excellent place to land, Ruth immediately ordered White to descend to that place, where their group could stop to begin their daily training. A few hours passed, and Ruth and Minos had already fought a few times, but the young steward had lost even more decisively. After leveling up, Ruth was able to ignore his support technique, devouring art, completely, so he was even more vulnerable. But this was still decent training for Minos since he could understand better the differences in levels. After all, even though he had the knowledge of the god Henricus Longus, learning from practice was always better. There were specific details that only through many battles could he understand. At that time, Minos had just cultivated his spiritual energy, which he had previously exhausted by training his battle techniques. After fighting with Ruth, Minos still had to devote time to training his support technique since it was not being so well trained when fighting with his mate. So, he took the time to exercise it after repeated defeats. "Ruth, come on. We are going to travel for a while and find a place to camp," he said after getting up from the floor and walking over to where Ruth was waiting for him. The two then walked to the Great Eagle that was drinking water from a stream that passed close to that place. They climbed on the great spiritual beast and set off towards the south of the Valley of the Beasts. More than 3 hours later, Minos and Ruth had arrived at a place at the foot of a hill. There was a small lake in that place, there was a flat terrain just a few dozen steps from the lake, and there were not many trees. It seemed like the best place for them to spend the night. So, the two youths went down with White in that place and set up a temporary camp in a short time. They had bought a medium-sized tent and some low-grade spiritual arrays to spend the night in this region when they were in the city of Santa Clara. After a while, the sun slowly began to descend on the horizon, making room for the night. Minos and Ruth were sitting in front of a fire while looking at the starry sky and talking about their lives. "Oh. So, do you mean you have an older sister? What's her name?" Minos asked with interest. Her name is Talia Miles, she is 6 years older than me, and she is already at level 53. It looks like your family has great talents, huh? Minos said as he thought about the things Ruth had said to him. It seemed that this young woman came from a large family of the Grey Cloud sect, which greatly influenced the sect with their many talented silver members. When Minos was going to say something, Ruth interrupted him and said in a serious tone. It looks like a group of spiritual beasts is approaching this place. The great eagle that was resting beside their tent raised its head and looked in the direction where the beasts were coming from and then looked at Ruth. She then said that there are about 50, fourth-stage spiritual beasts, all of which are at the limit of that stage of cultivation. Well, it's not that bad. Since it is approaching us, we can only use it for my own training. Minos sighed as he reflected on what was going to happen. He would not hunt spiritual beasts unless he needed to do so. But it was not because Minos had an equal thought with these beasts but that he would not provoke any struggle of life and death without there being a need for it. He liked fights, but he was not a fanatic who is always looking for problems, creating chaos wherever he goes. But if the enemy, whether human or not, came to look for problems with him, then Minos would fight with everything he had. That was his personality, and that was what he would do in situations like this. What do you want to do? Ruth asked. She knew this could be suitable training for Minos, as fighting with her was very stressful for him. After all, no one likes to lose repeatedly to the same person. With that, this was an excellent opportunity for Minos to vent the stress accumulated in the last 2 days. Well, let's do this. You go up to White and watch me from the sky. I want to fight these beasts alone, but you can come down and help me if there is a need. He said with a slight smile on his face. Okay. Ruth nodded in agreement and soon went over the area with her eagle. Chapter 86. Boars. You are listening at novelfull.audio. While Ruth was observing the area where Minos was from above, he had taken his grade .2, low-grade sword from his spatial ring and prepared for the impending battle. It didn't take long, and a group of 50 wild boars started to appear in Minos' vision. Each had 2 sharp canine teeth that protruded out of their mouths. These teeth were slightly curved upwards and measuring about 20 centimeters in length. Each of these wild boars was 1.5 meters high and certainly weighed more than 400 kilograms each. It also had many brown hairs and small, completely reddish eyes. Looking at the boars in front of him, Minos could see that this pack was hungry due to the saliva that was dripping from the mouths of many of these spiritual beasts. It was here to hunt them down and then feed on their meat. Well, since that is the case, I don't need to take it easy. He thought as he prepared to start fighting. Fighting with a group of spiritual beasts was not an easy task. Unlike humans, spiritual beasts had a sense of cooperation that was far superior to that of humans. Because of this, even beasts with low intelligence were able to give work to their enemies, hunting in large groups, as in this case. The boars began to look at Minos even more sharply as if they were preparing to attack the young man in front of it. But unfortunately for these spiritual beasts, they had not yet reached the 5th stage, when they could better probe the surroundings where they were. That's because, even if Minos couldn't handle them, there was still Ruth and her eagle, who were just a few feet away, waiting for the fight. At that time, the boars finally entered the area that Minos' techniques would influence. And realizing this, he immediately activated his techniques at once. Devouring Art. Indestructible Body. Spatial Sword. In doing so, Minos' body suddenly increased his strength and hardness, while a dark ring appeared a few meters above where he was. Slowly the spiritual energy of the 50 beasts began to be converted into energy for Minos to use when an invisible force quickly blocked the space around a distance of 40 meters from Minos. As the spiritual beasts had not yet reached the 5th stage of cultivation, and therefore, they were in the same stage as Minos, so many of them were being affected, to the point that they were barely able to move. Of course, as their number was simply enormous, some wild boars were not being restricted like others. But even so, the speed of all of it had been severely reduced. And as much as spiritual beasts are stronger than humans at the same level of its, this is only related to their physical strength. As they could not use techniques and were under the influence of Minos' attack technique, it only remained to bear it. Meanwhile, Minos quickly began to make his movements with the sword, gracefully and nobly. With that, in a fraction of 1 second, several blades of air were hurled at those beasts who suffered the most from the influence of the spatial sword. Swoosh! Swoosh! The blades flew towards the great bodies of the boars while these beasts felt a mortal danger approaching it. Some of it tried to deflect with everything it had, but it was challenging to move in that place. It was as if something involved its bodies and increased resistance to movement. Grr! Grr! Wailing sounds were heard when at last several boars were hit and hurled into the distance. Most of it were still alive, but about 10 wild boars died in that single attack. Ryanch! Seeing the results of the first attack, Minos wasted no time and soon continued to attack while seeing that some beasts were already coming towards him with angry looks. Well, come. With you, I can at least win. Minos thought about it while he fought. Having his techniques ignored when he fought Ruth gave him a very suffocating feeling, which stressed Minos a lot. Because of that, being able to destroy these spiritual beasts was quite satisfying for the young Minos at the time. Spatial sword. Another set of blades was thrown while 4 wild boars hit Minos with full force. Swoosh! Poof! The attack of the 4 boars only pushed Minos back, while his powerful defense absorbed all the damage from the attack. At the same time, yet another group of wild boars were making noises of pain for the last time before they finally stopped breathing. While Minos fought with the group of boars, Ruth was watching and probing the fight the entire time. She knew that the young Stuart was powerful, but she was still worried about him. That was 50 spiritual beasts. Each of it was stronger than he. And even if it were from the same stage, this was still a difficult fight. But when she saw Minos' performance as he fought, Ruth soon put the worry aside and began to form a beautiful smile on her face. She didn't understand why, but she felt very good about seeing it. It was a feeling that was almost as if she was proud of him. It looks like he will be able to deal with all of it. She analyzed the situation calmly. Minos' techniques really were quite dominating, and Ruth recognized this even more when she saw it were at work against other living beings. If the difference in our spiritual energy was not so vast, I could never ignore these techniques. She thought as she sighed softly. Ruth then murmured to herself. I have to try harder to increase my cultivation. Otherwise, he will leave me behind. Meanwhile, Minos had already killed more than 40 wild boars in the last 8 seconds, leaving him with only 2 more seconds before his defensive technique collapsed. And when that happened, Minos would be completely exhausted and would no longer be able to fight. After all, he was using a grade 2, low-grade sword, which required a lot of his body these days. Minos then hurried and activated his attack technique once again, making several moves towards the vital points of the remaining enemies. Spatial sword. Swoosh! Swoosh! The blades ran towards the 7 remaining boars, which were now wholly stopped. It, too, had already exhausted most of its reserves and were no longer able to ignore the restriction imposed by Minos' attack. These spiritual beasts were sweating cold when it finally received their respective blows. Boom! The dead bodies were hurled at a distance while destroying a part of the vegetation in the vicinity where the fight was taking place. Ha! 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 Minos held on to the side of a tree, breathing vigorously, while his clothes were completely wet with sweat and with several tears. His defense technique was excellent, but it only protected the physical body of its user. Phew, it's finally over. He exclaimed in a low voice, trying to recover from the tremendous nighttime effort he had just gone through. At the same time, seeing that the fight was over, Ruth descended from the sky with her great white eagle beside the land where they were camping. Seeing this, Minos smiled at her but said nothing. He just sat in a meditative position and began to circulate his cultivation technique, solar god breath. At the same time, several spiritual crystals appeared around him, while they shone brightly and had its energies gradually sucked out. While Minos was cultivating, Ruth immediately started gathering the bodies of all 50 beasts in one place. After that, she instantly incinerated them so that the smell of blood would not attract other spiritual beasts from this region. She and Minos had no interest in collecting the meat from these beasts. First, they both had large quantities of crystals, and second, they did not want to delay their trip to look for a place to sell these beasts. With that, it would make no sense to occupy the small space of their spatial rings with the corpses of beasts as worthless as these. 3 hours passed quickly, and Minos had finally fully recovered from the previous battle. At that point, he and Ruth decided to alternate while one rested and the other watched the surroundings. After all, they were in a place called the Valley of the Beasts, so it wouldn't be very good if they both went to sleep at the same time. With that, time quickly started to pass when the day's rays took place at night, while the surroundings gradually became clearer. Right now, Ruth was at the top of a tree, looking around this region and waiting for Minos to finish his rest. She had taken the second round since Minos had just cultivated after the fight, being full of energy at that moment. With that, after sleeping for a while, Ruth switched places with young Minos, reaching the current situation. And after the day cleared, it was not long before Minos had woken up. With that, the two ate some spiritual fruits and disarmed their tent when they finally left this place to continue their journey. Soon after, an embraced couple could be seen taking off on a large white eagle from this place, near a lake, at the foot of a hill. Chapter 87. Getting to the City of Flowers. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. 2 days passed. At this moment, Minos and Ruth had already covered almost the entire Valley of the Beasts, which was between the City of Flowers and Santa Clara. At that point in the trip, the two youths had already had some training sessions together. Also, they fought against other groups of spiritual beasts. Minos had not even come close to causing problems for Ruth during his struggles. He could only release his stress on the spiritual beasts that attacked them during that time. But not all fights were like that against wild boars. On the second day of the trip, Minos and Ruth came across a group of red monkeys, a breed native to this region of the continent. Anyway, there were 2 spiritual beasts in this group that had already reached the 5th stage in cultivation, which forced the beautiful young woman to help Minos in his battle against those beasts. This fight ended up being very intense, and the 2 youths chose to stop to rest for longer than usual after dealing with those monkeys. This caused their trip delayed a little, but it didn't make much difference to them. Minos was not in a hurry to reach the capital of the Cromwell Kingdom. After all, it was still more than 2 months before the start of the spiritual tournament. And as for Ruth, although she had a bit of prey to get to that city before, now she didn't think so anymore. After starting to interact with Minos physically, she liked to be able to extend the time of the two together. And being alone was undoubtedly a big bonus for both of them. After the tournament was over, she would most likely be stuck in her sect until she reached level 50, so that was a time when she could relax next to Minos. For this reason, neither of them bothered to take longer to reach the kingdom's capital. At that moment, the sun was overhead, and the winds were blowing hard through the trees, while several birds could be heard. In an open place, next to a small river, there were 2 youths and a big eagle in this place. At that position in the Valley of the Beasts, there were no longer many strong spiritual beasts that could threaten Minos and Ruth. This was because this was the region bordering the City of Flowers, which was about 200 kilometers from this place. Because of this, most of the spiritual beasts did not stay in this region since hunting was very common in areas bordering human territory. So, Minos and Ruth were standing there quietly while cultivating their spiritual energy. As for their safety, well, that was left to the great white feathered eagle. White was a fourth-stage spiritual beast in cultivation, so it could safely watch over them in a place like this. Finally, a cracking noise was heard, coming from Minus' direction. Crack. It was not as high-pitched as it had been in Ruth's advance, but it was already audible even a few feet away from Minus's body. He was cultivating hard for most of his spare time, so he had gotten the chance to break to level 37 today. After that happened, Minus opened his eyes and got up from the place where he was meditating with a big smile on his face. After fighting so many times, he realized that his cultivation speed had increased a little. And that was indeed one of the possibilities to increase someone's speed. This is because if we consider that the cultivation of an individual as a reservoir, there would be an increase in the stored volume at each level of that reservoir. But to store more, you couldn't just cultivate the whole day. For example, a person who eats a lot can gradually increase the size of his stomach. But it happens little by little. If it were done in one day, the person would die due to a rupture of the organ. The same was valid for cultivation. The reservoir could not withstand significant increases at once. The body had its own limits and did not allow a cultivator to cultivate all his time. Even spiritual demigods had to stop cultivating from time to time. Of course, they could cultivate for a century without stopping, but more than that would be impossible. However, there was a way to shorten that interval between each cultivation session. And that was depleting all of your spiritual energy during a fight and then cultivating to recover. As for doing this in normal training, well, it didn't work. In regular training, cultivators focused on increasing their compression in their techniques. Therefore, they had to take more time to absorb what they had learned before continuing to advance. So, you couldn't use that to speed up the cultivation speed. Or it could, but the cultivator would not be able to improve his understanding of his own techniques. Anyway, this was a choice that no one would make in this world. Having a high level would be great, but if your technique is not at the equivalent phase, its power would be severely impaired. For example, Minus' current attack technique is in the third phase and could affect a user's 40-meter radius. But if he went up to the fifth stage of cultivation before reaching the fourth phase of the technique, then his technique would remain restricted to 40 meters. Minus's strength would be equivalent to the level, but not the restriction. And when he faced stronger enemies, they could certainly escape the small area quickly, making the strength of Minus' technique unimportant. After all, no matter how strong an attack is, if it doesn't hit the target, then it is just useless. For this reason, the cultivators' mastery over their respective techniques was crucial. After a few minutes, Ruth finally finished her cultivation session, when she opened her eyes and saw Minus waiting for her beside the big eagle. She immediately realized that he was happier than usual and soon probed him. You level up again. Congratulations on that. At this speed, you can reach level 38 before the spiritual tournament. She said with the corners of her lips slightly raised. It looks like he will give me more trouble in the fights after today. Thanks. Now we are going to continue to this city of flowers. We have to buy a map when we get there, don't forget this. He said as he approached Ruth. After that, the two kissed warmly while they felt the strong desire for something more in their bodies. In those days when they were in the Valley of the Beasts, as they had to sleep separately, the two had no other game as had happened in Santa Clara. So, their sexual tension was even higher than before. After a while, the two finally broke the kiss when they climbed on the Great Eagle and took off towards the south of this region. Some time passed, and the two were already a few kilometers from the City of Flowers, already having a view of how big this city was. Minus and Ruth had no information about this city, but the population of that place was already over 1.2 million. And although the Cromwell Kingdom is known for agriculture, there were still many well-represented professions within this kingdom. And this city was an example of a place developed through the diverse professions that existed in the spiritual world. This place was in a region with few agricultural lands, but it had still developed since it had a strong local trade. There were array masters, blacksmiths, doctors, alchemists, poison masters, beast tamer, seers, cooks, etc. These were the various professions in this city and what made this place so well developed. Upon landing outside the city, Minos and Ruth left White and then began to visit the City of Flowers. And soon, they found out why this place got that name. There were a colossal amount of flowers in each city's gardens and public buildings. It was surely an interesting image to see and also brought a pleasant smell to the city. And as it was still day when the two arrived in this place, before looking for a hotel, the two went to a store in the central part of the city, where the coachman of their carriage said that they could find the maps of this region. They wanted to know where to make their trip, just as they did in the Valley of the Beasts. And it wasn't long before Minos and Ruth arrived in front of a relic store, which had a bird symbol looking at what looked like a map. This symbol is interesting. Minos thought to himself with a smile on his face as he entered the store's interior. After entering the store, he and Ruth soon saw several showcases with different maps and prices. There weren't many people in the store, but there were still 6 customers and an old man, who seemed to be in charge of the store. Seeing that the group was talking, Minos and Ruth decided to take a look at the place before finally looking for the old man's help. It would not be polite to interrupt them when they entered that place. At this point, something that interested Minos was said aloud by the old man. Chapter 88. Warrior, Grade Medicine, *, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Yes, you heard that right. You can find this warrior.grade medicine in the region. The old man said in a disinterested way. I said. See, let's go to that place right away. A young man with black hair said, looking at the rest of his group. They had heard this rumor from a coachman in the City of Flowers, so they came to this store. They wanted to buy accurate information, as he had only heard that medicine was in this region. Still, they did not know where to look. After the group heard the old man's confirmation, they soon left the store, heading towards one of the city's exits. Meanwhile, Minos approached the old man and asked curiously. Sir, can you tell me a little more about this subject? The old man looked at Minos for a second and thought contemptuously. Another poor fellow interested in this news. By his aura, he must have just reached level 37. Why does he want to know about it? Either way, he won't be able to use it until the spiritual tournament. This old man had obtained this information from his subordinate. He had used some of his acquaintances to spread this news to young people passing through the City of Flowers, going to participate in the spiritual tournament. He couldn't do anything with that medicine, so he was willing to get some crystals from some competitors who were interested in it. He knew that probably none of these people would be able to harvest this medicine, but that was their problem. After being silent for a while, the old man said. There are 500 low-grade crystals for the information. Minos immediately gave a small bag with the crystals, and then the old man continued. Well, a few days ago, I was notified by a subordinate that there was a warrior.grade medicine in the region of the Peak of the Fog. It is a medicine called rainbow fruit and is already ripe. If you don't know the region, you can buy a map for 2,000 low-grade crystals. Minos then paid quickly and collected his map with the old man. After that, he and Ruth went looking for a hotel to spend the night in this city. BDNVLDM halfway through, Ruth finally asked a question curiously. Minos, why are you interested in that information before? She did not understand how a warrior.grade medicine could move Minos' interest. First, he didn't need this to increase his cultivation speed. Second, it was only one medicine and would not be used to help his soldiers. Third, he had enough crystals to buy many of these medicines. Minos laughed and said. Well, just because I don't need it, I don't want to say that I can't be interested. But the main thing here is that it can help me more than you think. Ruth frowned and asked. How? I'm going to harvest this medicine and plant it on the Black Plain. It may be just one now, but it has valuable seeds. In the spiritual world, spiritual medicine seeds were not easily found in stores. They were precious, so the families that held it collected it before selling the medicines. This is because seeds were useless in the production of spiritual pills. As a result, these families would not give up their seeds since this would increase the supply of resources in the market, reducing the slice collected by these powers. As a result, it wasn't easy to buy seeds in the spiritual world. And even if someone were to sell seeds, its price would be considerably high. Ruth understood what Minos wanted, but she still had many doubts about it. She then continued to ask. But I believe that other people must already be competing for this medicine. Do you think it is worth joining this? Perhaps it has even been harvested. Minos smiled and massaged Ruth's face fondly, then he said. Not necessarily. It is not that easy to harvest medicines. If you want to preserve the spirituality of both the seeds and the rest of the plant, then there are some conditions for this to be done. First, the person who collects must have a specific way of doing this. Each medicine has its characteristics, so even an alchemist who knows how to harvest a certain medicine may not know how to do it with another. And when we are talking about wild plants, like the one in question, it is much more difficult than normal. As you may know, alchemists study a lot about the various medicines available. But most of the plants catalogued by them are those that have been domesticated a long time ago. Therefore, those that grow naturally in nature are much more complicated. And the second way to harvest such a plant, which is to have a high spiritual sense. For this, in the case of a warrior-grade medicine, the cultivator must be at least in the 6th stage of cultivation to feel the plant's spirituality, with such precision that he could harvest it without damaging it. And well, there are certainly some people in this city who meet these requirements. But alchemists who can do that are not interested in a single warrior-grade plant, and the same for spiritual kings. It was not easy to harvest and reproduce wild spiritual medicines. Certainly, even a grade .2 alchemist could take a long time to achieve this without outside help. All of this made this type of medicine less attractive to those specialists. This leaves only those cultivators that are weaker and with fewer crystals, who are going to keep an eye on this medicine. But it is improbable that one of them will be able to harvest it without damaging it. What if someone did that? Ruth said, smiling. So, it won't matter. We continue our journey as if nothing has happened. She then replied. But do you know how to harvest a medicine like that? You are not even an alchemist. Luckily, I learned a way to collect spiritual medicines. I just need the right tools. He said with a smile on his face. Back in the spatial kingdom, Minos had inherited a set of tools for collecting medicines. It had been made by an array master and a high-level blacksmith at the request of Henricus Longus. These tools repel spiritual energy, which makes it perfect for collecting medicines. With its unique characteristics, it could only be used in the right parts of the medicine, in the parts where there was no flow of spiritual energy. Minos then said before they finally reached the hotel. With that, I can save some crystals from the Black Plain. The cost of spiritual medicines alone covers almost half the price of a pill. They entered a more than 10 stories high building, heading towards the hotel reception. Minos then slapped his hand on the counter and said with a smile on his face. Receptionist, give me a double room. Upon hearing this time, Ruth showed no thought against this idea, even showing a beautiful smile on her face. In fact, she wanted it herself. Being alone in a room was what she had been wanting for days. Even if she still wasn't sure of giving herself over to Minos, she was very anxious to be touched intimately by him and to touch him too. Staying these almost 4 days in the Valley of the Beasts prevented them from going so far in their games since, at least, one of them needed to be alert about the risks in their surroundings. Here, sir, your apartment is number 801. A young man said with a smile on his face as he handed the keys to Minos. Shortly after receiving it, Minos took one of Ruth's hands and proceeded to the central part of the entrance hall, where there were 4 elevators. Minus then looked into Ruth's eyes as they waited for an elevator and smiled. He didn't want to start cultivating as soon as he got to the room. Today he wanted to reverse the order of things a little. Seeing Minus's longing look, Ruth quickly understood the meaning and smiled slightly. She was happy that he had the same intentions as she did. It was much better to be with someone like that. The two finally arrived in their room, on the 8th floor of the hotel where they were staying. This room was even better than the previous ones that Minus had gone through, even having an air conditioning array that heated and cooled. There were lots of lights in the room, with ample space, a place to cultivate, a kitchen, 2 bathrooms, and a beautiful view of the City of Flowers. The rest was, as usual, a big bed and a decoration according to the place where they were. Minus then locked the door and went towards Ruth, who was already sitting on the end of the bed. They began to kiss warmly while they undressed little by little and exchanged caresses. Ruth had a misty look in her eyes and a flushed face while she had her hair tied up in a big ponytail. For Minus, his expression was quite normal, apart from the lustful look in his eyes. In front of him, the young woman really did have a stunning body, which made him want her as he had never felt before. Even though he met many beautiful women and even had a session with the beautiful Elena, his lust for Ruth was on a whole new level. Ruth was then half naked, while Minus was more daring, being completely naked. Seeing this, Ruth blushed even more, when she noticed the size of Minus's rod. It seemed even bigger than the volume she was already used to feeling. So big. She murmured in a low voice. Chapter 89. Ruth's first time, 18+, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 89. Ruth's first time, 18+, seeing Minus's rod, Ruth felt something deep inside her changing. As if it were a call to her, which freed her from any lingering doubts in her heart. At the exact moment, Minus lay down beside Ruth and began to kiss her fervently. The tongues of the two were massaging each other while they tasted the flavor of each other. The two kissed very well, almost as if they were the ideal match. As they kissed, Minus had one of his hands stimulating Ruth's graceful left nipple, which was small and pink. At this moment it was completely stiff and emitted a feeling of pleasure throughout the beautiful young woman's body, each time Minus stimulated it. Minus had learned from Elena to prepare his partner well before putting his seeds on the ground. His woman needed to be stimulated in different ways so that the sensitivity of her body was increased to a certain level, which would improve a lot the rest of the fun. For this reason, Minus highly valued these touches on Ruth's body. As she felt Minus's hands travel over her body, Ruth occasionally let out a moan of pleasure, which excited young Stuart even more. It was heavenly to hear the sounds of a beautiful woman, and it would make any man's blood warm. Time passed, and soon Minus' other hand hit Ruth's little sister, which was now completely wet. Upon feeling this, Minus smiled and looked at his partner's beautiful face before finally starting his movement. While kissing his partner, Minus' hand was inside her panties, massaging the pink pearl of Ruth's little sister, with rotational movements, making her feel increasingly hot. Ruth couldn't hold back the pleasure, breaking her and Minus's kiss to let out a loud moan of satisfaction. Wow, how can this be so good? She thought about it while taking a corner look at Minus's pulsing stick. She felt a reluctance for a moment, but she finally moved forward with one hand until she touched Minus' big member. It is so hot and hard. That thought crossed her mind while she had a lost look on her face. It was as if she didn't know what to do. Seeing this, the corners of Minus's lips went up quickly, and he said, "Why don't you move it up and down?" Ruth then turned and stood on all fours, her face right in front of Minus's stick. She then started to make the movement advised by her companion, increasing the speed little by little, following the advice of young Stuart. "That's right," Minus said in satisfaction when Ruth seemed to get the hang of it finally. However, the young woman suddenly stopped her movement. Upon feeling this, Minus, who was enjoying her beautiful ass, found it a little strange but soon felt something different. He felt something wet and warm start to wrap his rod in a slow, smooth motion. That was Ruth's tongue. Did you like that?" she asked in a passionate voice. She had felt an enormous desire to put that stick in her mouth, so she had stopped for a second ago. This is even better." Upon hearing this, she smiled happily and began to suck on Minus's stick as if it were a lollipop, lubricating it along its entire length. And Minus did not stand still, just watching. He adjusted his body with Ruth's, in a position of 69, and soon began to taste her little sister. In doing so, he removed the last piece of clothing that was left on his companion's body, catching the first glimpse of Ruth's beautiful little sister. It was neither big nor small. It had medium-sized lips and was completely pink. Minus could see the small pearl highlighted at the top of Ruth's slit, and there was no hair on that part of her body. He could also smell a pleasant smell from it, which made his heart beat faster. Upon feeling this, Minus could no longer hold on and soon began to kiss Ruth's slit while having one of his hands scratched her bottom. When Minus's tongue finally hit the pink pearl on top of Ruth's little sister, she couldn't help it when she stood up in an electrified position, feeling enormous pleasure. She felt as if a shock of pleasure passed through her body the moment Minus touched a particular part of her. After that, she let out a long moan as she looked down and thought. That way, I won't be able to hold myself. Soon after, she went back to her previous activity, sucking on the great dragon of Minus. But this time, she went even further. Ruth put the tip of the stick in her mouth while trying to take it as deep as possible. BDNV. Upon feeling this, Minus' eyes opened with a lust sparkle when he felt his younger brother step into something hot and humid. Ruth was doing better and better and was already figuring out how to do things for herself. "Oh, that's right, do it faster," he said before returning to enjoy Ruth's sweet flavors. And it wasn't long before Ruth and Minus reached their climax. The two reached their orgasms almost at the same time, with the beautiful young brunette getting there first. Squirt. Ruth's sweet juice was thrown from her little sister right in the face of Minus, while part of it went straight to his mouth. At the same time, she trembled softly at the height of pleasure when Minus finally released his liquid into the young woman's mouth. Sensing something was coming, Ruth slowly pulled the Minus stick out of the back of her throat when she finally felt a viscous liquid being released in her mouth. It tastes very good," she thought as she tasted the white liquid from Minus. But not everything had come out of the beautiful young woman's mouth, and part had been thrown on the girl's lips. When she felt this, she immediately erotically used her tongue, licking every drop of the essence thrown on her face. "Oh," Minus made a muffled sound, but soon afterward, Ruth said, "Let me clean it up." And then she started to lick all the remaining liquid off his stick, with a look of desire on her face. This girl. After leaving Minus' rod clean, Ruth's desire had not decreased in the slightest, and she was experiencing an intense burning sensation between her legs. It seemed that this time, stopping halfway would not do for her. No, Ruth's body seemed to want the whole thing today. Wow. It seems that I can't hold myself anymore, she thought with a dirty look in her eyes. She then turned and looked into Minus' eyes and said, "I'm ready." Seeing the lush expression on her beautiful face and hearing that, Minus just said, "Are you sure?" She just shook her head and agreed. Ruth didn't even wait and lay down next to Minus, spreading her legs for him to penetrate her. Seeing this, Minus shifted his position, staying on top of Ruth. This was a great way to take her virginity, a position where he could have more control over how deep he would go, and he could also look her in the eye while doing this. It was just perfect. In doing so, Minus, who was also not satisfied with just doing some foreplay, placed his big dragon next to Ruth's little sister and said, "Ready." This may hurt a little at first, but soon the pain will pass, leaving only pleasure. Ruth agreed, shaking her head as she looked at Minus and his dragon passionately. This was an extraordinary moment for her, and she was pleased to do that with someone like Minos. It didn't take long, and Minos began to penetrate his member into Ruth's cave slowly. Ah! This. It hurts a little. She thought to herself, at the moment when Minos' stick had been pushed into it slowly, gradually destroying her hymen. It didn't take long, and Minos's rod began to pierce Ruth's cave faster and faster, while a few drops of blood began to stain the sheets on the bed that the couple was on. Deeper. Shortly after Ruth lost her virginity, she began to feel less and less pain and more pleasure with Minos' penetration, moaning and asking him to increase the intensity of the thing. How good this is! Minos thought about it, as he felt Ruth's inner walls milking his stick when he felt a heavenly sensation passing throughout his body. He couldn't help but compare Ruth to Elena. Despite the young blonde having a lot of knowledge and knowing exactly what to do to make her partner reach a climax, the feeling of doing this with Ruth was even better. Pa! 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 The two changed their position, with Ruth sitting on top of Minos while riding the young Stuart's stick with passion, rubbing herself with the intimate part of her partner at high intensity, making the characteristic sounds sound through the environment. While Ruth gave everything to her partner, Minos accompanied her on his leg movements when he had his hands on the girl's waist, sometimes passing one of his hands in the beautiful ass of her, looking her in the eye with pleasure. It didn't take long, and the two of them had already reached orgasm again while they had beads of sweat putting on all parts of their bodies. At that moment, young Ruth's second hole pulsed violently. At the same time, the inner walls of her wet cave sucked Minos's pulsing rod with voracity while she released large amounts of fluids. But the two were immersed in a lustful desire that they could not stop their fun, continuing their activities throughout the night.